There's a lot going on. All of us are kind of stressed looking at all the images on in the news, and it's about time for us to really get together to discuss these issues, because we are Americans, we are Black Americans, and the issues of racism, police brutality are things that affect us. They affect our brothers and our children. So today we have a panel of 3 speakers who are going to address various aspects of that. So we have Dr. Imali Abala, professor at Ohio Dominican University, Dr. Wanjala Nasongo, a professor at Rhodes College, and Dr. Kefa Otiso, a professor at Bowling Green State University. So we're going to start with Dr. Abala, who is going to introduce the topic and put things into context. Then we'll go to Dr. Nasongo and Dr. Otiso discuss different aspects. Then we'll be able to answer questions that you may have. So if you have a question, please use the chat function to submit your question. Then we'll be able to direct them to wherever you want to have that question answered by. So Dr. Abala.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think we are supposed to give 1 minute comment first. Okay, thank you very much for taking your time to spend it with us on this very somber day when we know that Floyd was laid to rest. And one of the things that we were supposed to kind of reflect on was how actually seeing the image of Floyd pinned on the road affected us. And I started by looking at it from the perspective of a mother. And as a mother with a male child, seeing that image of that young man pinned on the ground by the police drew tears to my eyes. And as most of you know me, I always like to write poetry. And the first thing I did was to actually jot down 2 stanza poem, which I'll share with you, and then I'll go back. I named it 846. He expired like a sparkle on a flint, though when he left home, he hadn't made a debt with death. Instead, he rendezvoused with uniformed men whose carelessness ushered his end and sparked an unstoppable global rage, much like an unhinged runaway caboose, as much as waved Black Lives Matter. He had been subjected to public lynching, though he didn't know when he left home it was his last, never bidding family adieu. That unflinching eyes would his quashing witness, held to public scrutiny to unbiased eyes that sees and memorializes truth with its ugliness. As he whimpered his final words, I can't breathe. And his head went limp below God's red tent of sky and made my enraged heart throb my ice water. Thank you.
Dr. Nasongo, your 1 minute reflections?
Oh, yes. These have been very difficult times. And when watching that video of our brother getting smothered to death was chilling. And it has remained etched in my mind. So much so that, like I was mentioning to some of my colleagues, it's difficult to find solace in anything, seeing what happened on that day. It is one thing to read about the experiences of others. It is a different thing to experience the self. And it forced me to look at generally the experience of our people here in the United States. And I find the statistics quite chilling, in the sense that if you look at it from the issue of the different ethnicities in the country, we as Black people seem to be targeted. We are hunted like animals. The statistics indicate that of every 1 million white Caucasian Americans, only 12 get killed by the police. Of every 1 million Hispanics, 23 are killed by the police. Of every 1 million Black people, 30 of us are killed by the police. So we are 3 times more likely to be killed by the police than the Caucasians. It is quite chilling. And for the most part, we get killed without any probable cause, just like the case of Floyd indicated. The man had been subdued. He never resisted arrest. He was in handcuffs. And yet, he was pinned on the tarmac and smothered to death. It brought to my mind, and this is, I think, what I need to focus on with regard to the immigrants, especially African immigrants. I think the first most notable case of an immigrant getting killed unfairly was the case of Madou Diallo back in 1999. 4 police officers in plain clothes pumped 19 bullets into the body of this 23-year-old who was standing on his stairs at the apartment in the Bronx. They shot 41 bullets, 19 of them hit him. Why? When the police were indicted, all they could say was that they suspected him or they saw him as fitting the profile of a serial rapist who had been reported to the police 1 year prior. So you can imagine that. Just being profiled as a rapist, you get pumped with 19 bullets. The second case of an immigrant, an African immigrant killed, was in May 23, 2003. An unarmed guy from Burkina Faso called Osman Zongo was shot 4 times by, again, a New York police officer. The police officers were actually trying to investigate a fraud case that people were counterfeiting CDs. And they found this guy in the warehouse where this was supposed to have been going on. But the guy had nothing to do with the counterfeiting. And this police officer was dressed as a postal guy. And so when he saw this guy Zongo trying to put on lights, he drew his gun. And so Zongo did not know whether this was a police officer or was just another thug who was around with a gun because he was not in police uniform. So he took off. And when he took off, this guy followed him and shot him dead. The third case happened July 24, 2009, where a homeless Sudanese immigrant, Jonathan Deng, was killed by cops in Iowa City, in Iowa, after a scuffle with another guy. So he was involved in a fight with another guy. The police arrive, and all they do is shoot this guy to death. Another case is of September 25, 2012. A Guinean immigrant called Mohamed Ba was shot 8 times. And this was a very, very emotional thing because this guy was suffering from some kind of mental illness. He was under physical and emotional distress. So his mother called 911 for purposes of getting an ambulance to get him to hospital. But unfortunately, the police were the first ones to arrive, armed and with guns drawn. The mother tried to explain to them what was going on, but they stormed the house as if they were storming the house of drug dealers with guns drawn. They shot him 8 times and he passed on. A fifth case is one of March 1, 2015, the Cameroonian called Charlie Cunang, who was killed in Los Angeles. This was a homeless guy staying in a district called Skid Row, which is littered with tents. He also got into a scuffle with another guy living in the same tent. And then someone outside the tent called the police saying a robbery may have been going on. So the police arrived again. They pulled the man out. He tried to resist. He was shot dead. A sixth guy is June 14, 2015, a Sudanese immigrant called Deng Manyuon. He was a homeless guy in Louisville, Kentucky. He was going through very difficult times. Unfortunately for him, he's one of the lost boys, if you remember the story of the lost boys, but he had come on to hard times. He got involved in a road accident and he didn't have the papers, he didn't have insurance. So he lost his car, he lost his license, he lost everything. So he was a distressed guy. And so at one moment, there was a woman who called police that she was under assault. So when the police arrived, they found this Manuel guy walking around. And again, he fit the profile of whoever had been said to have been committing assault. And so the police confronted him. One cop confronted him, but he resisted and he wanted to fight the police, so the police shot him. And then finally, September 2016, a Ugandan immigrant called Alfred Olango, 28-year-old, was also killed. He also had a mental issue, and the police were called by his own sister. And when the police arrived, without trying to understand the circumstances, they shot the guy dead. And the sister was in a lot of distress. And so maybe we are few big, if these are the only ones that we can have in terms of the African immigrants, but the fact is that we feel, and it is a reality, that we indeed are targeted, given the statistics.
Can I say something?
Songo? So we're going to have KEFA give a 1-minute reflection, and then we'll go back to Dr. Bala, and then we come back to KEFA again. So Dr. Otiso?
Maybe Barbara wanted to say something in...
No, I was just going to go to say the same. I didn't give my piece.
Oh, okay, then go ahead.
No, you go ahead and say your 1 minute.
Yeah, my 1 minute was basically to reflect on George Floyd's untimely death. I saw maybe 3 or 4 things that are kind of unusual. Obviously, it's a fairly unreal thing. None of us have seen this kind of an human thing in real life being executed on video. So what I saw that kind of struck me the wrong way was looking at this officer very much determined to kill this individual, and not even worried that somebody is recording it. That to me, that's the kind of thing that will cause me to hide and run and take cover. But every time the video was rolling, it seems like he became more determined to finish the job. The second thing was the indifference of the other officers that were around. You wonder how among the other 3, none of them seemed to realize that this is serious, even there was even one that was actively trying to make sure that actually George was not helped by the civilians that were trying to help. So which raises the question of what happened to the humanity of our people, that you're almost seeing it as a movie, it doesn't bother you, so I don't know whether they thought it was pretending, but still it's just, it's crazy, yeah. The other thing that somebody mentioned earlier, I'm not the originator of this, was that actually we were able to see a very unusual form of justice of an individual who was arrested, tried on the street, convicted on the street, and executed on the sidewalk. And you can actually replace everything I said about street by sidewalk. So you get arrested on the sidewalk, you get tried on the sidewalk, you get convicted on the sidewalk, you get executed on the sidewalk. That is actually a very serious indicator of the kind of lack of value for for Black lives that we're seeing, because you can be sure that will never happen to many other people in this country. So what you might be seeing is a case of, people that look like us, sometimes we might be convicted. You just go to court to prove your innocence rather than going to court you're already convicted. So you go basically to prove that you're not, doing something wrong. And then the other two quick things was the harshness of the sentence for the crime. I mean, you're counterfeiting $20, you're already arrested, and you draw a life sentence for $20 worth of counterfeit currency. So that's, I mean, it's a case of the sentence not fitting the crime. And then, of course, you look at the loss of humanity, as I said earlier on in the whole thing. And somebody else has mentioned that, and there's a little bit of a spiritual twist to this, in the sense that it looks like when we lost our fatherhood, we lost our personhood. Because everyone is shaking their head. How come nobody said, you are killing a person? Well, maybe they didn't realize that they were killing a person, because if you don't have personhood, then you're not going to look at your brother who you are killing as a brother. You're looking at him as an enemy. And then finally, of course, we lose the neighborhood. So where that seems to lead me is that we have a lot of programs that are trying to fix neighborhoods, when maybe we need to go upstream and fix the fatherhood first, then we recover a personhood, then we recover a brotherhood, then finally the neighborhood can be fixed. Thank you.
Thank you, KESSA. So one thing you mentioned that I just want to comment on about that $20 bill. It may have been counterfeit, but the guy may not have even known that it was counterfeit. He just happened to have it.
Exactly.
So it's just scary to be in a scenario like that. So we'll go back to Dr. Bala so that she can lay the context of these discussions that we are having and give it some perspective.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to begin by just generally talking about the experience of being Black in this country. And I begin with the assumption that many of us might not be very much familiar, or maybe even oblivious to the true plight of African American experiences in this society until we see it on the sidewalk, as we saw with George Floyd. Many of us may even have questioned why a majority of African Americans cannot succeed in this great land of opportunities, while new African immigrants do. And maybe, I say just maybe, we may also have friends and family members who share the same view. But the truth of the matter is, we did not come to this country in boats or shackled. We did not face the wrath of a master's whip against our backs, lacerating our skins. We came willingly and on our own accord. Moreover, most of us, before we even set foot on American soil, we had neither experienced nor faced racism or racial profiling. We came with our socials intact and not in tatters. We were not invisible like the famed character in Ralph Elson's novel called Invisible Man, where the central character proclaims, and this is to the comment that KESSA was making, I am an invisible man. And he says, no, I'm not a spook like those who haunted Edgar Allan Poe, nor am I one of your Hollywood movie ectoplasm. I am a man of substance, of flesh and bone, fiber and liquid, and I might even be said to possess a mind. I am an invisible man, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination, indeed, everything and anything except me. Therefore, on this forum, we come not as a people who have been traumatized and endured years of enslavement, discrimination, and racism, but those who know from where we came. We have a home in our motherland to which we can freely return, not our African American brethren, and possibly even our own children whom we have and are raising here in this country. So the truth of the matter is, our fellow brothers and sisters in this great land of opportunities have been victims of slavery and continue to this day. They have been denied the basic human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as it is depicted in the Declaration of Independence, which was signed July 4th, 1776. And maligned by racial segregation in the South. Between the Reconstruction era of 1877 all the way to the color of their skin. That is a fact that we have and must acknowledge and upon which ponder. That is why we are here today to reflect on how George Floyd's life has brought social injustice against people of color everywhere at the hands of those charged to protect us. The power of his dying words, "I can't breathe," forever inscribed on our hearts. We have seen images of monuments like Robert Lee in Montgomery, who was a symbol of white supremacy toppled. We also saw recently images of the statue of Edward Colton, who was a European slave trader who made fortune through slavery in the 17th century, failed in the UK. Also, with the same vein, we have seen or borne witness to drives of people marching the streets and crying for justice. And for us here as Kenyan immigrants, we cannot stay silent in the face of this injustice. We are here today at this hour to discuss how issues of racial profiling and police brutality affect African immigrants in this society. And not just African immigrants, but also persons who have been and continue to be victimized by these two ills. For this reason, I know for sure, as an African immigrant, my experiences, though slightly different from African American experiences, are not that very different. We all, I think all of us on this forum are parents in some way. We are husbands, we are wives, we have sons, we have daughters. And because we do have these people in our midst, it's upon us, or I say it's incumbent upon us, or even a moral duty to speak on their behalf. For they won't escape a white man's gun or brute knee pressed in their necks. George Floyd, Sean Reed, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Amadou Diallo, just to name a few. Because when white America sees us, they do not see accomplished people. They only see a Black man and a Black woman. When white America sees us, they do not see us as people. They only see us as just a Black man and a Black woman.
Something is wrong with your audio.
We can reduce the number of open videos, because that will help.
Okay, let me continue. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we lost you for a while, but I think now we can hear you.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me, but I'll say when white America sees us, they do not see intelligent beings. They see a Black man or a Black woman. They profile and judge us before they understand the content of our character. A cancer that knows no boundaries. We are convicted in the womb a reality to which we hope to engage in this session and our succeeding sessions. We must be trumpets for social justice. I conclude with the words of Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who profoundly proclaimed that if we are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If an elephant has its foot on the tail of a mouse and you say that you are neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. So let us be the beacon for change, because Black lives matter. And I also add, all lives matter, be it white or black. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bala. You just were so eloquent about that. And as all of you reflect on what she just said, really, this was more of a wake-up call for those of us who've not experienced this profiling in our personal lives. And watching that was really just to call us to action, to join the movement. So I'll let KEFA take on from here to kind of discuss with us what should be the way forward for us to be part of the change that we desire to see. KEFA.
I was going to mention a few things in terms of, some of our responses to police brutality. And in general, they fall under two categories. One are what you might wish to call fighting for social change. And then the second group of actions could be what you might refer to as responses at the personal level. I think I'll start with some of the bigger issues then, which is that we have noticed even in this crisis that African immigrants are beginning to invest quite a bit in better community police relations, particularly in places where we have large concentrations. I was told of a very encouraging example in Minneapolis, where the Ethiopian community has already pretty much organized with the local police that anytime they arrest their young people, they first call the elders of the community before they take them to jail, because we all know what happens once these individuals get to be, arrested. It becomes a downward spiral from there. So that's basically kind of something a little bit long term, but obviously we have been also involved in this protest. So we have begun to join hands with Americans to demand for police reforms. I even saw in either New York or Boston, a group of Kenyans who were leading chants again, in Swahili. So meaning that we were actually on the streets. In Minneapolis, it was a big group. Remember, in Minneapolis is where we have one of the largest concentrations of Kenyans. And so they were actually, and of course, this thing happened in Minneapolis. So on Saturday in particular, this last Saturday, they were on the streets in force, trying to have their voices heard. So there's this call for, joining with the rest of America in demanding for police reform. And I hope you've noticed that what makes these protests different is the multiracial nature and generally trending towards younger people in general. So there's a kind of hope that in fact, this involvement in joining other people in calling for reforms, in calling for different police training might actually end up leading to change. So that was very gratifying. The other one that we are seeing is actually it began almost like, I'll say maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it wasn't necessarily a response to police violence, but I think it was a recognition that even though we all like to say that we are going home next year, we might actually be here to stay. Going home next year is a very convenient formula because it's always true. Those of you that have done a little bit of computer programming like myself, you know that if you put in anything like x plus 1, you create an infinite loop. The computer will never stop because it's always true. So all of us keep saying, I'm going next year, then you are 30 years, some of us 20 something, 30 years, 40 years, and finally you have grandkids, you're like, well, where are you going? So I think this realization is beginning to get us more involved in the political process. We have had a Kenyan, I think in the Carolinas, run for office in Congress, and I think in California, somebody ran for the office of the governor. What I've been trying to do even myself lately, particularly in places where you have a high concentration of Kenyans, is to challenge people to get into some of these mayoral local political offices. In Minneapolis in particular, I'm trying to make sure that in the last 2 years, we had somebody run for a mayor of Brooklyn Park. And actually, a few years back, there was a Black lady who was a mayor of Minneapolis. I think her name was something like Sales Belton. She actually came to one of the Kenyan immigrant events in Minneapolis, and she was like, "What is wrong with you people? You have enough numbers here to actually be able to be mayor." So in Brooklyn Park, now that office is occupied by a Liberian, even though in fact we have far more Kenyans up there than we have people from other immigrant groups. And you have noticed that in the Somali community, we have a member of Congress from that community, Representative Omaha, who was actually interviewed by one of the Kenyan immigrant ladies up there last weekend. And I think you've seen some of the videos circulating around. So in other words, we're beginning to be involved in the political process. And I think it calls, and even I think in Tennessee, we have a member of our community that has joined the cabinet of, I think it's in Tennessee, and somebody can correct me later if I'm wrong. But I think all of this is coming from the realization of that we really cannot afford to be invincible. In 2000, Professor John Arthur, who teaches at the University of Minnesota, wrote a book, Invincible Sojourners, African Immigrant Diaspora in the United States. So remember, the book is written in Minneapolis, where we have one of the largest concentrations of African immigrants, but we are not visible. And I'm told even more recently, the mayor of Brooklyn Park, who is actually a white guy, he was also interviewed by some of the Kenyan folks up there, was almost asking some, and I'm told that he's asking privately, you guys say you are thousands of you in Brooklyn Park, how come we never see you? We don't see you on the school boards, we don't see you on local elections and those types of things. But so that seems to be changing, and a number of us and some of you here on this forum are beginning to agitate our people to basically be involved seriously in that political process. So those are what you might call the larger forms of response to police brutality. They're not necessarily driven by what we saw yesterday, because police brutality did not begin yesterday. It has been going on for a long time. And all of us have been kind of feeling this racialization that we're going through and some of the consequences that come with it. And therefore, there's been more and more of an intent to actually engage the process. I think what I'm trying to say here is that we have not done a very good job. I'm happy that we're beginning to see seeds of change, but there's more we need to do on the political arena. There's more we need to do in terms of championing police reform. There's more we need to do in terms of improving relations between us and the police. New York City has done a very good job of this in particular. They actually even have an office within the police force that is specifically dealing with immigrants. And some of the immigrant groups that have taken advantage of that office have actually ended up having better outcomes between themselves and the police. Remember when Amadou Diallo was being killed, I don't think the police had a way of knowing that he was not, an African-American, and nothing wrong with being African-American, by the way. So it's just that I don't think they knew. And so the issue becomes that if we are not actively engaging them to the level that we should, we will pay a price. And then, of course, now at the level of self-protection, obviously, you can see that there are cases where people basically want to lie low. It's not necessarily a very effective strategy, but it's basically avoiding problems. And there's actually a lot of that all of us do. Avoid, minimizing contact with the police, making sure that perhaps your taillights are working, because these are some of the small things that actually cause police in particular, to want to think, well, if the taillight is broken, there might be something else that is, So I've actually seen people arguing that, you have to make sure you avoid whatever you can prevent. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with having this approach of prevention is better than cure. Now, remember, I'm not blaming us as victims necessarily of these things, but what I'm saying is that even African Americans, I'm sure many of you know, will tell you that there are some talks they have with their kids in the house. And of course, remember, when you are telling your kids how to survive, chances are you are also telling yourself some of the basics of self, protection. I recently hosted another forum that was like this, and we had it mostly involving lawyers. And one of the lawyers told us directly that if you are not doing it already, you need to make sure you memorized at least one lawyer's number, because a lot can go wrong within the first few hours of being arrested. If you don't post bail, for example, if you have, then now you're booked over the weekend, for example, and those types of things. Actually, for example, somebody told me in Minneapolis, one of the community members there is beginning, something that they always look at the county jails every Monday to see who was arrested. And unfortunately, a lot of our people are beginning to show up. He was telling me that he's seeing about 4 or 5 people showing up every Monday morning. And so the community is now obviously responding in terms of posting bail and wanting to find out who this is. But I think what I'm getting at here is that I think we need to do more in terms of prevention rather than scanning the police arrest records, and there's nothing wrong with that. And even if that is the case, by the way, once somebody scans that, then of course they're able to say, oh, by the way, my friend seems to have been arrested. Let's galvanize and organize and get them out of prison. So those are some of the basic things. And the other one I forgot is the significant role of the Kenyan diaspora media in highlighting these instances of police brutality, as well as, of course, highlighting cases of the victims of this brutality and educating us. In COVID-19, we have this Zoom that actually seems to have been a godsend. I've known about Zoom for a while, but I think Zoom was meant for this day and age. And COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to connect over some of these things. And, even now, I think we're basically, quite frankly, we can actually even call this particular meeting a response to police brutality. That the intellectual class is beginning to stand up and actually think of how we might teach, how we might do research, how we might engage in advocacy, and how we might even engage in service activities that actually help to stem the tide of police brutality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. T. So it's just amazing the items you touched on, being engaged. Like, I was really touched when you talked about most of us saying we're going back home, because that was the attitude we had. Many people would be like, I'm going to work very hard, save money, go buy land, build a house, and I'm going home. And some of them are in their 60s and they're still here. So this is really home. So we need to treat this as home and work to make it better for our children and grandchildren. So I hope we can continue that conversation. So I'm looking at the chat. I don't see a lot of questions, but there's one for you, Dr. Nasongo. You talked about several cases of African immigrants who were killed. Do you have any information on what happened in those cases? Was anybody ever held accountable?
Yes, in one of the cases, I can't remember exactly which one. Let me begin with the Diallo case. The Diallo case, the 4 police officers were arraigned in court, but they were never convicted. So they were set free. In the case of the Senegalese, the Cameroonian who was killed in California, nothing happened to the police officer. Same case in the case where the policeman came for the mother who had called for an ambulance, and they ended up killing the guy with 8 bullets. They were sued, but nothing happened. So actually a civil suit was filed, and the family was paid, I think something like 2-point-something million. In another case, the family also sued. I think in the case of the Ugandan, they were paid 1.95 million. But in all the cases, the police went scot-free. Now, let me just add that I think I made my presentation, the longer presentation first, instead of the reflection 1 minute. Let me just take a second to say that I have actually been very distressed. I have 3 sons, all right? One of them, the elder one, born in Kenya, the 2 are born here. And after seeing what happened to George Floyd, I begin to wonder whether I actually made the right decision to remain in this country. Because personally, I can go back home. My sons who are born here, this is their home. So they are stuck. And so this is the reason why we have to do something, as Kefa is saying. We need to engage, and we have to participate, and we have to be part of the process of demanding for change. And this, especially with the one thing that I have found out in reading about why the police kill, one reason is the way they are trained. There is a guy called Gross, I forget his last name. He goes around, I think he makes 200 trainings of police forces per year. And he trains them in what he calls kilogy. Kilogy. Telling them their job, if you cannot decide on the spur of the moment to take a life to defend others, then you should not be a police officer. So they are indoctrinated to kill. And so unless that training also changes, that is why in the case of the police post in Minneapolis, where the councilmen have actually voted to disband the police force, they have tried for years to reform. That has happened. And I think it has a lot to do with the training. And that is why I agree with KESSA when he said, we may be focusing on the grassroots when in fact upstream is where the major problem is. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nasongo. So I have a question for Dr. Bala. And you talked about the context, the historical context, and you're one of those who raised a son here in the US. I think I saw your son in this Zoom meeting, unless there's another Bala. But what did you have to do as a mother? Because we keep hearing these people talking about having the talk with their sons. Mm-hmm. We were not trained to do that. And many of us really never considered telling our children anything because we always knew they are fine. As long as they're doing the right thing, we didn't think they'll get in trouble. So Dr. Bala, could you share maybe some of the things as a parent that you thought you had to do to allow your child to become an American Black boy?
Well, first of all, I have to say that raising a son who is American or African American, in my view, he's a true African American because I'm an African mother and he was born here. But I think for me, the question should be more in terms of the paradox that we face as parents who are living in areas where our kids interact more with white kids than actually Black kids. So therefore, they kind of find that they really don't get to understand truly that African American people's experiences. And so it becomes a paradox in the sense that to sensitize them to the fact that they are Black. And my son would be one of the first people to tell you, I always told him that you are a Black man and you have to be able to understand that you may have white friends, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't know who you are or your identity. So some of the things that I did, and I have to commend one of our hosts, our colleague on this forum, Ebi Luvaga, she and I made a concerted effort to make sure that we took our sons to places where we knew that both boys would become exposed to the history of African Americans. And one of the places we took the boys to was to go to a plantation in South Carolina. It's called Boone Plantation, where they were able to visit the actual places where slaves slept. They were able to, or we were learning with them too, because I'd never experienced it before, went to the mansion where the master always stayed. So we began with that historical part. We went to a slave market to kind of give them a sense of what it was, and then eventually segued away to Georgia to visit the Martin Luther King place. But besides that, I am a person who loves to read, and I made sure that I did introduce my son to books at an early age, beginning by reading, I think it was Martin Luther King's biography, and then he eventually read the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is an enormous read, and he also read Invisible Man, which is the novel that I did mention in my remarks. But my goal was to actually expose him to the reality of what African Americans have experienced, in spite of the fact that he hasn't lived that particular life. And not to out him, there were times where he felt that I was being overly cautious by stressing the idea that he is a Black kid first, that's the reality of being in this particular country. So I'm hoping that kind of answers the question in a long way through it.
Thank you, Dr. Bala. So I'm going to have one question for KEFA, for Dr. Tiso, then we'll stop recording this session and go to the next session where we can ask questions back and forth. So this question was submitted by Dr. Boyd ahead of time. So the question she's asking, in reference to the First Amendment as stipulated in the Constitution about freedom of speech, how can we as immigrants freely participate on issues of racism and justice without fear? So Dr. Tiso, you talked about us being engaged, so we can be engaged in all these other things, but how about being engaged in activism, if I may use that word?
I think the activism starts with, you know, there are two sets of things in the Constitution. One are the rights, and then there are the responsibilities. And among the rights, you have the freedom to express yourself, freedom of worship as you wish, right to a prompt and fair trial, right to vote in elections for public officials, right to apply for federal employment requiring US citizenship, right to run for elected office, and freedom to pursue life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So when we did the legal implications of COVID-19 talk a few weeks ago, one of the things the lawyers mentioned over and over again is that many of us fear even the courts because we think that if you go there, it's going to be expensive. And yes, it can be expensive, but actually a lot of these cases don't necessarily take a whole lot of money. But we should, I mean, the message was simple: don't be afraid to enforce your rights. So you see, there's this right to prompt and fair trial by a jury. There are many cases where many of us give up our rights. You know, you get stopped and the cop says, then you have to see me in court. And in some cases, if you think you've been aggrieved, you know, instead of actually making a court appearance, you simply sign away your rights, that you are actually doing 100 in a zone of 70, when in fact that may not be the case. But you see, if you go to court, it's up to the cop to actually prove there was a radar gun that was actually working, that actually clocked you at 100 miles an hour in a 70-mile zone. And by the way, if you look at the rate at which some of these cops actually show up in court when you actually say, I'm going to court, is actually not that impressive. There's a whole lot of them that actually never show up, because in a court of law, things can change. Defending a traffic ticket, I think, is something like $300, but it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And of course, I'm not making light of $300. But consider the implication of sometimes signing away your rights, and then now you start digging your way back out of that hole. So there are certain rights, and unfortunately, it's not the officer's responsibility to tell you what the rights are. It is our responsibility to educate ourselves and actually be willing to enforce them. So obviously those rights are paired with responsibilities on the other side. You know, stay informed of issues affecting your community, participating in the democratic process, respecting and obeying federal and state and local laws, respecting the rights, beliefs, and opinions of others, participating in your local community, paying your income and other taxes honestly on time to federal, state, and local authorities, serving on a jury when called upon, and those types of issues. Now you can see, therefore, that for me, I like to summarize it this way. Building a community that you and I want to live in is not the responsibility of somebody else. Life is a contact sport. So none of us gets the freedom to sit back and let somebody else do the heavy lifting, and then we end up enjoying the fruits of that heavy lifting. And it's something that I've tried to do much of my life. And one of the other things I was going to mention, particularly for this crowd, is that any state where you guys are, they are what they call state commissions that actually form a lot of policy, as I've come to find out, because I serve now on the new African Immigrants Commission in Ohio. You'll be surprised how much policy is made in these types of places. And they're looking for people like you and I all the time. So for example, in that commission that I serve on, whenever we have a meeting, the Deputy Attorney General has to be there. And we also have somebody from the governor's office being there. So for example, all this business of COVID-19, we've been consulted pretty much every Friday. There is a standing meeting. What do we need to do for the Black community? How do we need to approach this community? any number of those types of issues. So in Ohio, for example, we've just finished doing a quick report in collaboration with the Health Lightening Committee that was set up to look at COVID-19. They basically, these calls are like, guys, what do we do? We don't know what to do. We don't know what immigrants need. And remember, some of the places where you and I live have very many immigrants, like in Columbus, Ohio, for example. We have a lot of Somalis. We have a lot of African immigrants from Ghana, from Kenya. Don't assume that the government knows what our needs are. So it's actually been quite enlightening for me to sit in some of these rooms. For example, there was a time we were talking about police arrests of immigrants who couldn't speak English. So one of the things we've ended up doing is to try to see whether we can introduce a way for some of these things to be translated. The driver's license exam in my state used to be in English and Spanish. Now Swahili is coming online, Arabic has come online because we simply asked for it. Even COVID-19 announcements in Ohio now have actually come out in Swahili because we asked for them, So notice what is common about all these things. It is not going to happen by you and me sitting in the house and wishing that things will get better. I've actually had another conversation like this recently, and people were more interested in venting about how angry they were that George Floyd was, murdered in the way he was. But my constant refrain was, okay, after the anger, what next? What are the next strategic moves you're going to make as a community to make sure that you don't get victimized? The other thing, even in my own city, I'm involved in another committee on Welcome Bowling Green, but actually what it is using immigrants to repopulate the city. So in that committee, guess who is there? The chief of police, the sheriff of the county. When they meet you there, and even some of the suggestions you were making in terms of how you treat immigrants, they are more receptive in that environment than you going to see them arresting somebody. And then now you're trying to tell them, hey, you are doing the wrong thing. And I'm not suggesting that the public should not be involved in that process, but it's much easier to engage with them when they see you as a human, when they know you as another expert on my committee. And then they actually listen better, as I came to find out. And the Hispanics have done a much better job of doing that. Because, for example, when we have our city meetings, that is actually where the lady who runs a local NGO, in almost every meeting I've been to, I was like, Sheriff, I was at your office the other day. My person from my community was not treated right. You see, in this setting, the sheriff has to respond. But if it's at the setting where they are arresting somebody, they can tell you I'm within my rights to arrest somebody. So there are a number of small things we've actually had them to agree to in that setting and at the state office in Columbus, that they will never agree to, no matter how much noise we make out here. So that is how I would, maybe it's a long-winded answer, I'm sorry, but we simply have to be involved. And especially if you look at your state commissions, for every one of you here, Imelda, we need you at the health policy, health and human services. You probably do that already. By the way, every one of us here, if you go to your state commissions, they're always looking for people. If they are full, wait for them to basically expire and apply for any one of them. Then in that room now, you actually make policy that affects us, including how we are policed.
Allow me to add something about exercising those rights. I think there is a flip side to it as well, because we have our fellow immigrants here who are not with legal status.
Yep.
It becomes very difficult for them to do so. And a case in point here is in 2017, in a small town in Mississippi, there was a 911 call for domestic violence. And the police arrived, but they knocked on the wrong door. The wrong door they knocked, there was a Hispanic guy with a bulldog. So the bulldog came out. The police shot and killed the man. And remember, they have knocked on the wrong door. They killed the guy. Unfortunately, he did not have papers. So when the widow actually sued the police, the state put up a case that being an illegal immigrant, the guy does not have the rights under the 4th Amendment. He does not have rights under the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is about guaranteeing equal protection under the law. So then there is a dilemma. All you have to do is very nice, but perhaps only those of us who are in legal standing can be able to do so. Our brothers and sisters who are not, it becomes very difficult. And so you can see that the law becomes problematic, because how can a state argue that a human being has been killed accidentally? And yet they argue that he cannot actually sue because they don't have legal standing. I mean, they are not protected under the Constitution the way the citizens are protected. So it's very problematic.
But I think a quick response, and Shadrach, I'm glad you raised that issue because, for example, in the commission, it's a big thorn in the flesh, you know. But what I found is once people are organized, let's say as Kenyans we're organized, and our money is to a degree collective in terms of credit unions, businesses, and those types of things, then it puts us in a responsibility to protect those that have no purpose.
Yeah.
A big problem right now is that even those of us that have an ability to actually do something, we don't do something. That's why I was talking about this crowd in terms of membership in state commissions, for example. I mean, look at what KESSA has done for us, you know. Many of us would have never even met, you know. So if you think of that example in terms of now, if we were to organize in other sectors, let's say we organized in terms of business, we organized in terms of, so for example, in the commission, we have ended up creating a list of lawyers, immigration lawyers, and those types of things that actually we can consult on a short-term basis. Those are the sorts of things that people like me and you can do, and even to make sure that this guy does not sign away his rights, even though he doesn't have papers. And remember that, as I've come to find out, what you sign when you are detained affects how you're going to be treated, you know. Being in the country legally is actually not, I could be wrong, but I think it's a civil crime or something. You know, maybe Shadrach, you might know better. But it's not a very high offense as I used to think.
Yeah, it is not what they call what? It's not a criminal offense.
Yeah, I think it's a civil matter or something, but you guys can check it out on online after we're done so I don't mislead anybody.